Right now, you are wearing something. Maybe it's a t-shirt, maybe it's jeans, maybe you're reading this in bed in something soft and comfortable that you didn't give a second thought to putting on this morning. But your ancestors had none of it. No cotton, no polyester, no zippers, no buttons, no elastic waistbands. For most of human history, the question of what to put on your body every morning was one of the most important survival decisions a person could make. Get it wrong, and you died. Too cold, you froze. Too exposed, you were torn apart. And yet somehow, 300,000 years before anyone invented a loom, a needle, or a thread, your ancestors figured it out. What they wore will surprise you, because it wasn't what anyone imagined. And the story of how we know, that part changes everything. Most people picture ancient humans wrapped in a rough animal skin, a caveman with a fur draped over one shoulder, maybe barefoot, maybe holding a club. That image is wrong in almost every detail. Here's what's strange about ancient clothing. Unlike bones, unlike stone tools, unlike cave paintings, fabric doesn't survive. Cloth rots, leather decays, plant fibers dissolve into nothing over thousands of years. So for a long time, scientists assumed we simply couldn't know what ancient humans wore. The evidence was gone. But then archaeologists started looking at the wrong things in the right way. They didn't find the clothes. They found everything around the clothes. The needles, the scrapers, the dyes, the parasites. And what those things revealed about what our ancestors actually wore, that answer is stranger, more sophisticated, and far more human than anyone expected. Let's start with the oldest clue we have. In 2020, scientists analyzed a collection of ancient bone needles found across multiple sites in Siberia and China. The oldest of these needles, a single slender, carefully shaped piece of bone with a tiny hole drilled at one end, was dated to approximately 50,000 years ago. Think about what that means. Someone, 50,000 years ago, took a thin splinter of animal bone, shaped it into a precise instrument small enough to thread, and used it to sew, not to stab, not to pierce, to sew, with thread, which means there was thread, which means someone had already figured out how to twist plant fibers or animal sinew into something thin and strong enough to pass through the eye of a needle. That is not primitive. That is craft. But the needles only tell part of the story, because before you can sew anything, you need material. And the material our ancestors used most wasn't fur draped loosely over a shoulder. It was carefully prepared animal hide. And preparing it was one of the most labor-intensive processes in the ancient world. Here's what it actually took. When an animal was killed, the hide had to be removed quickly before it stiffened. Then it had to be scraped for hours, sometimes days. Using stone tools called scrapers, the ancient tanner had to remove every trace of fat, membrane, and flesh from the inner surface of the skin. If you missed a spot, the hide would rot from the inside. Then it had to be softened. Some cultures soaked it in water. Some used the animal's own brain, which contains exactly the right mix of oils and emulsifiers to soften leather. There is an old saying among traditional tanners: every animal has just enough brain to tan its own hide, and it's roughly true. Then it had to be stretched and dried in a precise way, pulled to the right tension while it cured, or it would shrink and crack and become unusable. This entire process, from raw hide to wearable leather, took days of skilled, careful work, and our ancestors were doing it at least 300,000 years ago. We know because the scrapers survive, even when the leather doesn't. Hundreds of thousands of stone scrapers found at sites across Africa, Europe, and Asia, all showing the distinctive wear pattern of hide processing on their edges. They weren't just surviving, they were manufacturing. But here's where it gets genuinely surprising. In 2011, a team of scientists did something nobody had thought to try before. They analyzed the DNA of human body lice. Not head lice, body lice, the kind that live specifically in clothing, that require fabric to survive, to lay their eggs, to exist at all. Body lice cannot live on a naked human body. They need the shelter of fabric. So the scientists asked, when did body lice first diverge from head lice? When did they first evolve to live in clothing rather than hair? The answer, approximately 170,000 years ago. Let that land for a moment. 170,000 years ago, long before the oldest needles, long before any cave painting, long before any artifact we've ever associated with complex human behavior, our ancestors were already wearing enough clothing, consistently enough, that a species of parasite had evolved specifically to live in it. The lice didn't lie. They had been living in human clothing for so long that they had become a completely different species from the lice in human hair. Evolution had taken its time, and that time told us something no artifact could. Humans were wearing clothes at least 170,000 years ago, possibly longer. But what did those clothes actually look like? Here's what the evidence suggests. And it's not a rough skin thrown over a shoulder. The earliest clothing was almost certainly tailored. We know this because of where our ancestors were living. 170,000 years ago, significant populations of early humans were living in environments cold enough that loose, untailored skins would have been useless. A skin draped over your shoulder doesn't keep you warm in sub-zero temperatures. You need sleeves. You need coverage. You need something fitted. The Neanderthals, our closest ancient relatives, who lived across Europe and Asia in some of the coldest conditions any human-related species has ever survived, show clear evidence of hide processing at their sites. But their bone needles are crude compared to later ones, which suggests they may have used a different technique, lacing or tying rather than sewing, to join pieces of hide together. Modern humans, arriving later with finer needles, may have had a significant survival advantage simply because their clothing fit better. A tighter seam kept out wind. A better sleeve kept out cold. The difference between a well-made garment and a poorly made one may have been the difference between surviving a winter and not. Clothing wasn't fashion, it was technology. But there's one more piece of this story, and it's the one nobody talks about. Clothing doesn't just protect the body, it does something else. Something that no other animal on Earth uses clothing to do. It communicates. In 2017, archaeologists excavating a site in Morocco called Bismoon Cave found something unexpected among the ancient debris. Dozens of small shells. The shells of a sea snail called Trichia gibbosula. Each shell had a hole carefully drilled through it. Each showed traces of red ochre pigment. These shells were approximately 150,000 years old. They were beads, decorative beads, almost certainly sewn or strung onto clothing or worn on the body. Not for warmth, not for protection, for appearance. 150,000 years ago, someone looked at what they were wearing and thought, this could look better. That thought, that specific, abstract, fundamentally human thought, is the same thought behind every piece of clothing ever made since. Every dye, every embroidery, every logo on every shirt you've ever owned traces back to a person in a cave in Morocco, threading a shell onto a cord, trying to say something about who they were. We don't know what it meant. We don't know if it signaled status or tribe or beauty or something we don't have a word for, but the impulse is unmistakable. They weren't just covering themselves. They were expressing themselves. And here's the part that makes that remarkable. The shells came from the coast, 40 kilometers away from the cave. Someone carried them inland. Someone valued them enough to transport them across a significant distance, specifically to use as decoration. That means trade, or travel, or both. 150,000 years ago, the clothing was already more than clothing. It was already culture. So here is what your ancestors actually wore. Not a rough skin thrown carelessly over one shoulder. Carefully prepared, labor-intensive leather, processed over days, fitted to the body, joined with sinew thread through bone needles, small enough to hold between two fingers. Clothing sophisticated enough that a parasite evolved to live in it. Clothing decorated with shells, carried from 40 kilometers away. The caveman image is almost exactly backwards. They weren't primitive people doing primitive things. They were skilled craftspeople solving complex problems with the materials available to them. The difference between their clothing and yours is not intelligence. It is time and access and 10,000 years of accumulated knowledge passed from one generation to the next. The next time you pull on a t-shirt without thinking about it, remember that somewhere between 50,000 and 170,000 years ago, someone sat in firelight, holding a sliver of bone thin enough to thread, doing something that had never been done before. They were making something to wear, and they were already thinking about how it looked.